We know that VPC creation requires upfront planning. You have to think about what kind of workload or applications are going to be deployed and then plan your network structure accordingly. And we've already seen how we can work with VPCs using the console. In this demo, we'll be creating a VPC and a subnet and tagging it, all using command line syntax with the CLI. I'm going to opt to use the CLI here in the console through Cloud Shell. So I'm going to click the Cloud Shell icon to open that up. Okay, once that's done, I'll run the clear command to clear the screen. And the first thing I want to do is create a VPC. Well, remember that you've got the built-in help system. If I were to run AWS EC2 help, remember that we will get an alphabetical listing of the next level commands after AWS EC2. For example, in the C's, notice we have create-VPC. I'll press Q to quit out of help. All right then, so if we did AWS EC2 create-VPC help, of course we're going to get the details on how to work with that. So specifying, for example, --cider-block, as well as IPv6 parameters. So I'm going to press Q to quit out of that, and we're just going to do it. So we're going to start with AWS EC2 create-VPC, and I've already planned I want a CIDR block that I'll specify with --cider-block of 12.0.0.0/16. So 16 bits in the mask. And I'll go ahead and press enter to create that. Now what should happen is it should give you some returned JSON output, which means that things are good. And I can press the spacebar here to go all the way down to the end until I press Q to quit out of that output. Now what I'm going to do is copy the VPC ID because I want to use the command line here to tag that VPC, and I will do it by referencing its ID. For that, my command will be AWS EC2 once again, this time though create-tags --resources, and here I've got my VPC ID that I just copied. Then I'm going to use --tags because I want to assign the name tag. So key equals name, comma, value equals, and I want to call this VPC2. I'll go ahead and press enter. So if I were to run AWS EC2, let's say describe-VPCs, it will return a list of my VPCs. I can just continue to go through the list until I come across the one that we've created, which used the 12.0.0.0/16 IPv4 range. And notice when we get down to the tags, the name is VPC2. Now, the next thing I want to do is create a subnet within that VPC. So I'll use AWS EC2 create-subnet. Now I'll have to tie it to the VPC with the --VPC-ID parameter, and this is where I'll put in the ID that we had copied earlier for our newly created VPC. Then I'll use --cider-block, and remember, your block of IPs here at the subnet level must fall within the range assigned to the VPC. You might recall that at the VPC level, it was 12.0.0.0/16. Basically, only the first two octets identified the network. So this subnet then needs to at least start with 12.0, which it does, and then we've got a .1.0 after that with a 24-bit mask, which identifies the first three octets as being the network portion of this IP address range. So this is valid and correct. So let's go ahead and press enter. We get the return JSON output. I'll just press Q. So we now have a subnet for that VPC. I'm going to go ahead and highlight the subnet ID here that was returned in the JSON output and press Control-C to copy it to my clipboard. And what I'd like to do here is modify an attribute of my newly created subnet to set the default for EC2 instances launched in the subnet to having a public IP address. So to do this, we run AWS EC2 modify-subnet-attribute. As you might guess, we need the subnet ID, so --subnet-ID. Here I've pasted in the subnet ID that I copied a moment ago. And what I actually want to modify in terms of an attribute here is the public IP on launch setting. And so that is actually a parameter for this in the CLI syntax, --map-public-IP-on-launch. Okay, and I'll press enter. So that'll automatically assign public IP addresses to EC2 instances launched into this subnet. So to name the subnet, I'll run AWS EC2 create tags resources, and this is where I'll specify the ID of my subnet. I'll use tags, and finally key equals name and comma value equals subnet2, because that's what I want to call the subnet, and I'll press enter. So if we were, for example, to go into our VPC management console, so here in the GUI, and go to your VPC. So the first thing we would notice is that we do indeed have a VPC called VPC2. If we go to subnets, we have a subnet called subnet2. And if we click on the link for that subnet ID to open up its properties, notice that the auto-assigned public IPv4 address has a value of yes. Of course, that's part of what we specified for when EC2 instances are launched into subnet 2.